The blast struck like a blow to the chest, sending clouds of dust and fragments high into the air above Red Line Ridge. Commander Veether's armored boots sank deeper into the soil as the shockwave passed over him. He held his ground, his gaze tightening. Behind the visor of his helmet, the ridge was vital. A stretch of earth and stone the Heron Empire could not afford to yield. It stood as proof of their power, the peak of their control over this war. But in this moment, only the fighting mattered. The human troops, dismissed for seeming lack of order, defended the ridge with a stubbornness that rattled Vather to his core. He had witnessed humans fall apart in the noise of war before falling back without order, leaving behind their strongholds. It was a shameful dishonor. Vather's hands locked tighter around the controls of his armored craft. His warriors, sharp-focused, loyal, held their positions. The human units, on the other hand, broke all rules of structure when the initial burst of human fire cracked through the sky. Vahar braced for a harsh advance. A charge instead, they broke formation like insects cowards. Vahar muttered low. His kind were sworn to an unspoken oath of pride, a sacred loyalty, and yet the humans appeared free from such rules. They would strike, they would flee, and sometimes they would return fiercer than before. A human team, barely a dozen, had left their ground, slipping down the slope in disorder. That their trained instincts could not grasp the move falling. Back was the greatest shame. No honor survived such a move. But instead of hiding, they stormed right back into the fight head first, willing to gamble everything, rushing into the most dangerous front. Vatar watched through his helmet feed as the human warriors ran at enemy lines, laughter echoing through the comms. A strange sound within the roar of blasts and shots. "They are mad," Vatar thought, his eyes narrowing. He had believed the fight was his, that the win was certain. Yet the humans, those reckless few, kept closing in. They showed no fear, that much was plain, and that unsettled him. His thoughts were broken by a flash of motion on his screen. Human troops had come back. Vatar blinked, his visor flickering briefly. The human team the same. Ones who had fled earlier were now moving with aim, with a sharper drive. They were no longer running away. They were pushing forward and dragging something behind them. A captured war machine fire exploded nearby as they surged across the field. Smashing through alien defenses, human troops riding the tank lifted their arms and weapons into the air, yelling, laughing as battle raged. One even waved a scrap of their flag, mocking the Heron fighters. Do they believe this is sport? Vither's mind raced. No. They were too focused, too lethal. He had studied their style before, wild yet always deliberate. The human team was not falling back anymore. They were not even just attacking, they were enjoying it. They charged in with the same wildfire they had earlier, but now with a stolen vehicle filled with extra charges, and used it to blast deeper into the conflict. What is this? Their voice cracked as he watched the chaos erupt. It all made sense in a flash. They had not run away. They had rearmed. The humans had not fled to escape. They had moved to resupply, to regroup, and return with heavier arms, greater force, louder fury than before. More rounds and something cool to ride. One human laughed, pointing at the tank, his voice full of thrill. Not the surrender. Vather had expected. That simple phrase, spoken like a joke during a storm, stayed in Vather's head. The human was correct. Vather's own forces should have been claiming their win. Instead, they were now falling back hard. The course of the fight had flipped without warning. The humans had twisted what looked like a reckless retreat into a tactical edge, turning the battle on its head. They had not given up the ridge. They had only stepped away to reload it. Meant more than a phrase. It was a mindset. The human units stormed back, and they did not pause until they stood deep inside enemy lines. They ripped through defenses, each fighter more lethal than the last. The Heron were left stunned. They believed the ridge was secure. They assumed the humans would fall apart in loss, but instead, the human warriors were taking full control of the war zone. Their weapons, their firepower, even their vehicles now belonged to their foes. Reload, one human called, Out through the comms, their tone a strange mix of joy and defiance. "We do not fall back. We reload the fight." Roared on, but Vahar felt the momentum slip. His ranks scattered, their cohesion crumbling. Their own thoughts spiraled as he tried to respond. The enemy was pressing from all sides, pushing his soldiers to the edge, but they had retreated. How could they be doing this? He blinked once more, the landscape warping the enemy. The humans were shredding his ranks. They had claimed the captured machine, and now were taking Heron troops as captives, actual prisoners of war. How is this happening?" Vatar demanded. His fighters responded with full strength, but the humans, they had already done what Vathar's troops never could. They had embraced the unknown, they had reloaded. "This is madness." One of Vath's officers whispered disbelief thick in his voice. "They are enjoying it." The war dragged for hours, yet the result was clear. Red Line Ridge would remain in human hands. They never backed down. They just reloaded as Vatar pulled away from the front, his body battered by loss. One phrase repeated in his mind: they never retreat. They reload, and he despised them for it. The sounds of warfare echoed around the ridge while Heron lines fell back. The human fighters, soaked in the chaos, surged forward with fierce energy. Smoke still filled the sky, but now it carried the scent of human victory. Commander Vatar watched from the back as his warriors reformed their shattered formation. A cruel reminder of what they had lost. A small laugh, bitter and hollow, escaped as he looked toward the human squad. A few warriors gathered around the stolen tank. They were not boasting, not shouting in celebration. Instead, they were getting to work unpacking. Supplies, readying weapons, making their next move. They needed no break to regroup. They had already reloaded. "Cursed beings," Vatar whispered. Only confusion remained. He had never seen methods like these. What kind of army abandons its ground flees, in mess only to come back with more? The human fighter. The one who had shouted reload was now crouched beside the broken tank rifle, gripped grin wide. He waved his team closer. "All right, boys, let's kick this off," the soldier said, voice steady, almost too relaxed. Vathar's mind spun. It felt like this human had no regard for what war was supposed to be to him. Success was meant to be direct, defined, and quick, but these humans turned it into something else. Something wild yet brilliant. He remembered. The word the human had spoken, reload. It was a plain word, but meant more than ammo. It meant thinking differently, adjusting fast and sometimes throwing rules aside. They had fooled him into believing they were done. That error had cost him the ridge. "Reload," Vathar whispered again. Tasting the sound, there was no dignity in it, none that he understood, but clearly it had worked. He looked toward his deputy, a young Heron officer named Kaler. "What do you see in this?" "Kaler." The officer was still stunned, eyes locked on the humans moving with urgency. "It breaks tradition." Kaler said, "We thought they were weak, yet they turned this shameful retreat into a reload." Vatar finished, his voice low. Something deep in his chest stirred. Maybe it was disgust. Maybe. All he couldn't tell. The ridge still stood held by humans, and the enemy wasn't in retreat. They had only paused, and now they were back with even greater strength. The Heron units had fallen back to their second line. The humans, with their strange and unpredictable style, were advancing, pushing forward with relentless pressure. Vahar stood inside his command vehicle, staring at the field through the tactical interface. On his display, he saw the human soldiers move in a rhythm, each one acting, like they knew exactly what needed doing. And then suddenly that same squad, the one that had pulled back in chaos, struck again. But this time they didn't come with heavy weapons or vehicles. They charged with blades and close-range weapons knives, in hand charging straight into the Heron ranks. "What is this madness?" Vahar yelled over the comms. Kaler began to answer, but enemy blasts cut him off. One of the humans now, just meters away, tossed a grenade toward a nearby heron group, sending them diving for shelter. There was no elaborate plan here. The humans were not relying on airstrikes or pinpoint artillery. They were relying on the oldest and most brutal form of war, close quarters. A human's face flashed across Vather's screen. The man's expression, wild mouth stretched in a blood-soaked grin. He looked like he was enjoying this every second of it, like it was more than war. It was something fun. You think this is some kind of joke? Vather snarled. But that was where he was wrong. This wasn't a joke to the humans. This was life reload. The human bellowed again, and the squad answered in perfect sync, shouting with wild energy. They weren't retreating anymore. They weren't following any military pattern. They weren't thinking tactically. They were overwhelming the heron by pure ferocity. In that instant, Vather understood the humans didn't want to win with honor. They would win by being unpredictable. They would win by forcing their opponents to doubt everything. They thought they knew, but why the answer was sudden and brutal. Vather realized his error from the beginning. The humans didn't fight for a goal. They didn't fight for glory. They fought because they loved it, because they lived in it. They didn't fear war, they flourished in it. Vahar had believed the human unit would fold under pressure, that they would fall apart in defeat. Instead, they had surged back tougher and louder. They were winning, not just with we,